The story begins on a sunny Saturday afternoon in Cedarbrook, a small town nestled in the Midwest, where the community was gathered at the local park for the annual Unity Day event. Families mingled, children laughed as they played on the swings, and local vendors handed out samples of their best homemade treats. For James and Sheila Carter, both highly respected captains in the Cedarbrook Police Department, this day was a symbol of everything they'd worked toward, a community striving to heal its racial divisions. Dressed in casual clothes, but maintaining their professional demeanor, James and Sheila strolled hand in hand through the park, stopping occasionally to chat with residents. Their presence was always a source of reassurance. People looked up to them, not just as law enforcement officers, but as role models who worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between the police and the community. James with his calm authority, and Sheila, known for her no-nonsense attitude paired with a warm smile, had earned the respect of nearly everyone in Cedarbrook. As the event was in full swing, Officer Mark Reynolds stood leaning against his patrol car at the edge of the park. A recent transplant to Cedarbrook, Reynolds had only been on the force for 6 months. He had come with a reputation. Stories of excessive force complaints and murmurs of a troubling attitude toward minorities followed him like a shadow. Though nothing had been proven officially, his interactions with the town's black residents had already raised eyebrows among his peers. Today, he was assigned to monitor the event, and his disdain for it was barely concealed. Reynolds scanned the crowd with a frown, muttering under his breath about pointless feel-good nonsense. His focus soon fell on James and Sheila, who were now speaking with a group of young people about careers in law enforcement. Something about the way they carried themselves irritated him. To Reynolds, their authority was a challenge to his own, and their prominence in the department felt like a threat. A commotion near the food trucks suddenly broke out, pulling Reynolds from his thoughts. A young man had accidentally bumped into a vendor, spilling a tray of drinks. The vendor, a middle-aged white man, yelled at the boy, who immediately began apologizing and trying to clean up the mess. Reynolds seized the opportunity to assert himself. He marched over, ignoring the apologies and immediately demanding identification from the boy, who appeared no older than 16. The crowd started to gather, murmuring uneasily as Reynolds' tone grew harsher. "Let the kid go, Mark," someone in the crowd said. "It was an accident." "Step back," Reynolds barked, his hand hovering near his holster. "I'll handle this." James and Sheila, noticing the commotion, quickly made their way over. Sheila stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Reynolds, that's enough. We'll take it from here." Reynolds turned, his face hardening as he recognized the couple. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," James said, his tone steady but authoritative. "You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to be escalated. Let the boy go." Reynolds' jaw tightened. The crowd was watching closely now, their whispers growing louder. He felt cornered, his authority challenged in front of the entire community. Without warning, he turned on James and Sheila, pointing at them aggressively. "If you're interfering with police business, I'll have to ask you to leave." James raised an eyebrow. "Interfering? Officer Reynolds, do you even know who we are?" "I don't care who you are." Reynolds snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're obstructing an investigation." Sheila's patience wore thin. "Investigation? Over spilled drinks? You're out of line." Reynolds' face flushed red. "That's it. You're both under arrest for obstruction of justice." The crowd gasped as Reynolds pulled out his handcuffs. James and Sheila, stunned by the audacity of the accusation, hesitated for a moment. Before they could respond, Reynolds grabbed James' arm roughly. "You have the right to remain silent," he said smugly. The crowd erupted in protest. "You can't do this," someone shouted. "They're police captains," another voice cried out. James and Sheila didn't resist as Reynolds cuffed them, knowing any resistance could only make things worse. But the humiliation was palpable. James locked eyes with Sheila, a silent exchange of disbelief and anger passing between them. "Do you even know who you're arresting?" Sheila said, her voice sharp with incredulity. Reynolds smirked. Yeah, two people who think they're above the law. The walk to the patrol car was the longest of their lives. The crowd was shouting now, their anger at a boiling point. Someone pulled out a phone and began recording, capturing every second of the injustice. Children who had been playing moments before now clung to their parents, their innocent faces filled with confusion and fear. As Reynolds shoved James and Sheila into the backseat, a young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her phone aimed directly at him. "You're gonna regret this," she said coldly. "The world's about to see who you really are." Unbothered, Reynolds slammed the doors shut and climbed into the driver's seat. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. But in the backseat, James and Sheila were already planning their next move. The humiliation they had just endured wasn't just a personal insult. It was a stain on the community they had worked so hard to protect. They weren't going to let it slide. As the patrol car disappeared down the street, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, transforming into a collective roar. The unity that the event had been designed to celebrate was now manifesting in a way no one had expected. The seeds of change had been planted, and the storm brewing over Cedarbrook was about to become national news. The patrol car pulled into the Cedarbrook Police Department parking lot, its arrival drawing the attention of several officers and staff members who had been going about their routines. When they saw James and Sheila Carter being escorted in handcuffs by Officer Mark Reynolds, confusion and disbelief rippled through the station. James and Sheila weren't just colleagues. They were pillars of the department, known for their integrity and leadership. Now they were being paraded through the station like common criminals. Reynolds held his head high as he pushed through the double doors, his grip firm on James's arm. Sheila followed close behind, her jaw clenched, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The tension in the air was palpable. As the trio walked past a cluster of officers, one of them, Officer Maria Lopez, stepped forward. "Reynolds, what the hell is going on?" she asked, her tone a mixture of shock and anger. "They were obstructing justice," Reynolds replied curtly, not breaking his stride. "Obstructing justice," Lopez repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea of who?" "I don't care who they are," Reynolds interrupted, his voice rising. "Nobody interferes with my job." Lopez's gaze flicked to James, who gave her a subtle shake of his head. He knew better than to escalate the situation further at this point. "We'll sort this out," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation coursing through him. Sheila remained silent, her expression a mask of controlled fury. Reynolds marched them to the booking desk, where the on-duty clerk froze at the sight of the captains in cuffs. "Is this some kind of joke?" the clerk stammered, looking from James to Sheila to Reynolds. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Reynolds snapped. "Process them." The clerk hesitated, glancing nervously at James. "Captain Carter." "Sir." "Do your job," Reynolds barked, slamming a report on the desk. "I've already filed the charges." The clerk swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to defy Reynolds. As the booking process began, James and Sheila stood silently, their dignity intact despite the degrading situation. The murmurs of disbelief among the officers grew louder, and several of them pulled out their phones, texting and calling others to share the shocking news. Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire through the department. Officers who weren't on duty began showing up, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. Lieutenant David Harris, a longtime ally of James and Sheila, stormed into the station, his face flushed with fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the room. Reynolds, who had been standing smugly by the desk, turned to face Harris. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant." "Your job," Harris said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your job is to arrest two of the finest officers this department has ever seen." "On what grounds?" "They were interfering with an investigation." Reynolds said stubbornly. The patrol car pulled into the Cedar Brook Police Department parking lot, its arrival drawing the attention of several officers and staff members who had been going about their routines. When they saw James and Sheila Carter being escorted in handcuffs by Officer Mark Reynolds, confusion and disbelief rippled through the station. James and Sheila weren't just colleagues. They were pillars of the department, known for their integrity and leadership. Now they were being paraded through the station like common criminals. Reynolds held his head high as he pushed through the double doors, his grip firm on James's arm. Sheila followed close behind, her jaw clenched, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The tension in the air was palpable. As the trio walked past a cluster of officers, one of them, Officer Maria Lopez, stepped forward. "Reynolds, what the hell is going on?" she asked, her tone a mixture of shock and anger. "They were obstructing justice," Reynolds replied curtly, not breaking his stride. "Obstructing justice," Lopes repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea of who?" "I don't care who they are," Reynolds interrupted, his voice rising. "Nobody interferes with my job." Lopez's gaze flicked to James, who gave her a subtle shake of his head. He knew better than to escalate the situation further at this point. "We'll sort this out," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation coursing through him. Sheila remained silent, her expression a mask of controlled fury. Reynolds marched them to the booking desk, where the on-duty clerk froze at the sight of the captains in cuffs. "Is this some kind of joke?" the clerk stammered, looking from James to Sheila to Reynolds. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Reynolds snapped. "Process them." The clerk hesitated, glancing nervously at James. "Captain Carter." "Sir." "Do your job," Reynolds barked, slamming a report on the desk. "I've already filed the charges." The clerk swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to defy Reynolds. As the booking process began, James and Sheila stood silently, their dignity intact despite the degrading situation. The murmurs of disbelief among the officers grew louder, and several of them pulled out their phones, texting and calling others to share the shocking news. Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire through the department. Officers who weren't on duty began showing up, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. Lieutenant David Harris, a longtime ally of James and Sheila, stormed into the station, his face flushed with fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the room. Reynolds, who had been standing smugly by the desk, turned to face Harris. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant." "Your job," Harris said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your job is to arrest two of the finest officers this department has ever seen." "On what grounds?" "They were interfering with an investigation," Reynolds said stubbornly. Harris's eyes narrowed. "An investigation into what?" "A spilled tray of drinks at a community event. Are you out of your mind?" Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Harris turned to the clerk. "Release them. Now." The clerk hesitated, glancing at Reynolds, who glared at him. "They've already been booked," he muttered. "I can't just." "Do it," Harris barked, slamming his hand on the desk. The room fell silent, all eyes on the standoff between the lieutenant and the officer. Reluctantly, the clerk began the process of releasing James and Sheila, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. As their handcuffs were removed, James rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable. Sheila, however, couldn't hide her anger any longer. She stepped closer to Reynolds, her voice low but filled with venom. "You have no idea what you've just done." Reynolds smirked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I did my job," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier bravado. "You think this is over?" Sheila said, her eyes boring into his. "You've just started something you can't stop." Harris stepped between them, placing a calming hand on Sheila's shoulder. "Let it go," he said quietly. "For now." James and Sheila were escorted to a private office, away from the prying eyes of the station. Harris followed, closing the door behind them. "Are you two okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "We're fine," James said, though the strain in his voice was evident. "But this isn't just about us. Reynolds didn't just humiliate us. He humiliated this entire department." Sheila crossed her arms, her expression hard. "We can't let him get away with this." The public outcry following the arrest of James and Sheila Carter was swift and unrelenting. By the next morning, the video of the incident had gone viral, drawing national attention. News outlets began broadcasting segments on the story, framing it as a stark example of systemic racism and abuse of power. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForTheCarters and #EndPolice, and Sidarbrook found itself under a spotlight it had never anticipated. Within the Sidarbrook Police Department, tensions reached a boiling point. Officers and staff were sharply divided, with some rallying behind James and Sheila, denouncing Reynolds' actions as reckless and racially motivated. Others, however, defended Reynolds, either out of loyalty, fear of departmental fallout, or shared prejudices. The station felt more like a battleground than a workplace. James and Sheila, though emotionally exhausted, knew they had to act quickly. They spent the morning in their modest home, strategizing with a small group of trusted allies, including Lieutenant David Harris and Officer Maria Lopes. The atmosphere was tense but determined. Harris leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "We need to make this official," he said. "File a formal complaint. Let the investigation force their hand." Sheila, sipping her coffee, nodded. "This isn't just about us anymore. This is about the culture in the department. Reynolds isn't the first to act like this, but he needs to be the last." James, usually the calmer of the two, spoke up. "If we go down this path, we have to be prepared for everything that comes with it. Retaliation, public scrutiny, even attempts to discredit us. Are we ready for that?" Maria chimed in. "You don't have to do this alone. There are people in this department who stand with you, and the community, they're ready to fight." As they deliberated, the sound of car engines outside drew their attention. James walked to the window and peered through the curtain. What he saw made his heart swell. A crowd had gathered outside their home. Neighbors, community leaders, activists, and families they had helped over the years. They held signs that read, "We stand with the Carters, justice now, and accountability for all." The sight brought tears to Sheila's eyes. The Carters stepped outside to address the crowd. James raised his hand, signaling for quiet. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you for your support, for standing with us. This fight isn't just about Sheila and me. It's about justice, dignity, and the kind of community we want to build together." Sheila took the microphone. "We've given our lives to this town, to this department. And while we've seen progress, we've also seen the cracks in the system. What happened yesterday wasn't just an insult to us. It was an insult to every one of you. We're not backing down, and we hope you won't either." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants echoing through the quiet Sidarbrook streets. Among them was Reverend Charles Whittaker, a longtime civil rights activist who had marched in protests decades ago. He approached the Carters after their speech. "You have a movement behind you now," he said, his voice gravelly but filled with conviction. "Don't let it go to waste." Meanwhile, inside the police department, Reynolds sat in his office, fuming. The backlash had been relentless, and his superiors had summoned him for a meeting later that day. Still, he maintained his stance, claiming he was being targeted unfairly. "This is political," he muttered to himself. "They're just trying to make me a scapegoat." At the meeting, Reynolds was confronted by Chief Douglas Barrett, a seasoned officer nearing retirement who had always prided himself on maintaining order within the department. Barrett's face was grave as he spoke. "Reynolds, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I was doing my job, Chief," Reynolds replied defensively. "They were interfering with an investigation." Barrett sighed heavily. "You arrested two of the most respected officers in this department over a non-incident at a public event. Do you realize how bad this looks? And now there's footage of you ignoring Sheila's badge and making inappropriate remarks. How do you expect me to defend that?" Reynolds leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "They undermine my authority. If I back down now, it sets a precedent." "What it sets," Barrett said sharply, "is a lawsuit. And not just from the Carters. The whole town is up in arms, and the department's credibility is hanging by a thread. You've dragged us into a mess we might not recover from." The meeting ended with Barrett placing Reynolds on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. As he left the building, Reynolds was met with a wall of protesters chanting for his resignation. His face burned with humiliation, but his anger only deepened. He muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." For the Carters, the fight was just beginning. Their formal complaint against Reynolds included not only the incident at the park, but also prior reports of his discriminatory behavior. Their lawyer, a sharp and fiery advocate named Patrice Daniels, worked tirelessly to build their case. Patrice was known for taking on high-profile cases of racial discrimination, and she wasn't afraid to take on the Cedar Brook PD. "We're not just going after Reynolds," she told the Carters during one of their meetings. "We're exposing the system that enabled him." As the investigation unfolded, the media descended on Cedar Brook, turning the small town into the epicenter of a national conversation about racism and accountability in law enforcement. News vans lined the streets, and reporters clamored for interviews. The Carters became reluctant public figures, their every move scrutinized. But the spotlight also brought new allies. Prominent civil rights organizations offered their support, providing resources and amplifying their story. Activists organized rallies and town hall meetings, demanding transparency and reform. The momentum was undeniable, but so was the toll it took on James and Sheila. They faced threats and harassment from Reynolds' supporters, and the stress of the situation began to weigh heavily on their shoulders. Despite the challenges, the Carters remained resolute. They knew that this fight was bigger than them. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, about the future of Cedar Brook, and about holding those in power accountable. As the investigation into Reynolds continued, more revelations began to surface. Whistleblowers within the department came forward, exposing a culture of bias and misconduct that had long been swept under the rug. The stage was set for a reckoning, and Cedar Brook was bracing for impact. For the Carters, this was no longer just a battle for their dignity. It was a battle for justice, one they were determined to win, no matter the cost. Harris nodded. "I'll back you, whatever you decide to do. But we need to be smart about this. Reynolds isn't just a rogue officer. He's a symptom of a bigger problem. If we're going to fight this, we need to fight it the right way." James and Sheila exchanged a glance, the weight of the decision heavy on their shoulders. They had dedicated their lives to this department, to this town, to the idea that law enforcement could be a force for good. Now they had to decide whether to protect the institution they loved or expose its flaws for the greater good. Outside the office, the atmosphere in the station was tense. Officers whispered among themselves, the division between those who supported James and Sheila and those who sided with Reynolds becoming painfully clear. Meanwhile, word of the incident began to spread beyond the department. The video of the arrest, captured by a bystander, had already been uploaded to social media, where it was quickly gaining traction. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, sparking outrage across the town and beyond. By the time James and Sheila left the station that evening, accompanied by Harris, the parking lot was filled with protesters holding signs demanding justice. The sight was both heartening and overwhelming. James stopped for a moment, taking it all in. "This is bigger than us," he said quietly. Sheila nodded. "Then we fight." As they walked to their car, the crowd parted, cheering and chanting their names. It was a moment of solidarity, a glimmer of hope in the midst of chaos. But as they drove away, James and Sheila knew that the real battle was just beginning. Reynolds had crossed a line, but it was up to them to ensure that the consequences went beyond just one officer. They had to challenge the system that had allowed him to act with such impunity, and they had to do it not just for themselves, but for every person in Cedar Brook who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or ignored. The fight for justice had begun, and there was no turning back. The investigation into Officer Reynolds and the Cedar Brook Police Department began to unravel layers of misconduct that no one had fully anticipated. As the internal review and public scrutiny intensified, the department found itself at the center of a maelstrom that extended far beyond the original incident with James and Sheila Carter. Every day brought new revelations, each one more damning than the last. Reynolds' suspension had done little to quell the public's anger. Protests outside the department grew in size, with people from neighboring towns joining in solidarity. The chant "Justice for the Carters" echoed through the streets daily, accompanied by signs demanding systemic reform. The small town of Cedar Brook had become a flashpoint in the national debate over policing and racial justice. News anchors broadcast live from the protests, capturing a community that had reached its breaking point. For James and Sheila, the days following their public statement were a blur of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. Their lawyer, Patrice Daniels, worked tirelessly to gather testimonies and evidence. She quickly realized that the case against Reynolds was only the tip of the iceberg. "We're dealing with more than one bad apple," Patrice told the Carters during a late-night meeting. "This department has a culture problem, and it's been festering for years." Whistleblowers within the department began to come forward, emboldened by the public support for the Carters. Officer Maria Lopes was among the first to speak out, providing detailed accounts of discriminatory practices she had witnessed during her years on the force. "It's not just Reynolds," she said during a recorded interview with Patrice. "There's a group of them, a clique. They share racist jokes, target minorities for petty arrests, and cover for each other when complaints come in." The most explosive testimony came from a young officer named Eric Davis, who had only been with the department for a year. Davis, visibly nervous but determined, described how Reynolds had pressured him to alter reports and ignore evidence in cases involving black residents. "He told me it was part of the game," Davis revealed. "He said if I wanted to survive in the department, I'd have to play along." Davis also provided a crucial piece of evidence: screenshots of a private group chat among certain officers, including Reynolds. The messages were appalling, filled with racist slurs, derogatory comments about residents, and boasts about abusing their power. When Patrice presented this evidence to the department, it sent shockwaves through the ranks. The chat logs were leaked to the media, sparking a nationwide outcry. Calls for resignations and deeper investigations grew louder. Chief Douglas Barrett, already struggling to maintain control of his department, faced mounting pressure to act. In a hastily arranged press conference, Barrett addressed the allegations. Standing before a crowd of reporters, his face drawn and weary, he said, "I want to assure the citizens of Cedar Brook that we take these allegations seriously. I have ordered an independent review of our practices and policies, and those found guilty of misconduct will face consequences." But the statement did little to calm the storm. Protesters viewed Barrett's words as too little, too late. The Carters, meanwhile, remained skeptical. "An independent review," Sheila said, shaking her head as she watched the press conference. "That's just code for sweeping it under the rug." James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about Reynolds anymore. It's about dismantling a system that's been allowed to thrive for decades. And that's going to take more than public pressure. It's going to take exposing everything." As the investigation deepened, Reynolds found himself increasingly isolated. His once cocky demeanor had given way to paranoia and desperation. He was receiving anonymous threats, and even some of his closest allies in the department were distancing themselves. Reynolds tried to defend himself in a televised interview, claiming he was the victim of a political witch hunt. But his words rang hollow, especially in the face of overwhelming evidence against him. Meanwhile, the Carters' lawsuit against Reynolds and the department began to take shape. Patrice crafted a powerful narrative, weaving together the Carters' personal ordeal with the broader patterns of misconduct revealed by the investigation. This case isn't just about what happened at the park, Patrice told the press during a briefing. It's about a culture of impunity that has allowed officers like Reynolds to act without accountability. This lawsuit is a step toward justice, not just for James and Sheila, but for everyone in this community. The lawsuit put additional pressure on the town's leadership. Mayor Evelyn Sanders, who had initially tried to stay neutral, now found herself forced to take a stand. In a public address, she announced sweeping reforms, including the creation of a civilian oversight board, mandatory anti-bias training for officers, and the dismissal of several high-ranking officials within the department. "The time for excuses is over," Sanders declared. "We owe it to our citizens to rebuild trust and ensure accountability." Despite these measures, the Carters knew that real change would require sustained effort. They continued to speak at rallies and town hall meetings, using their platform to advocate for deeper reforms. Sheila, in particular, emerged as a fiery and inspirational figure, her speeches often drawing standing ovations. "This fight isn't about bringing down one officer," she told the packed crowd at a community center. "It's about building a system that works for everyone. A system that treats every citizen with dignity and respect." The fallout from the investigation reached its peak when Reynolds was formally charged with misconduct, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. His trial became a media circus, with journalists and activists descending on Cedar Brook to cover every development. The courtroom was packed during the opening statements, with James and Sheila sitting in the front row. Reynolds, now a shadow of his former self, sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn. As the trial unfolded, the depth of Reynolds' misconduct became painfully clear. Witness after witness testified about his abusive behavior, painting a damning portrait of an officer who had repeatedly violated his oath. The prosecution presented the group chat logs, the altered reports, and the bodycam footage from the park incident, each piece of evidence reinforcing Reynolds' guilt. In the end, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, with many wiping away tears of relief and vindication. Reynolds was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a rare but significant victory in the fight for justice. For James and Sheila, the verdict was a moment of triumph, but also a sobering reminder of the work still to be done. As they left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, James turned to Sheila and said, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Sheila nodded, her gaze steady. "Then let's keep going." The Carters' fight had exposed the rot within the Cedar Brook Police Department and sparked a movement that reverberated far beyond their small town. But for them, the ultimate victory wasn't in bringing down Reynolds. It was in inspiring a community to rise up and demand better. And in doing so, they had proven that even in the face of injustice, ordinary people could create extraordinary change. In the wake of Officer Reynolds' conviction, Cedar Brook found itself at a crossroads. The courtroom victory was a seismic moment, but it was just the first step in a much larger battle. The spotlight that had been cast on the small town was now unrelenting, with activists, journalists, and even federal officials watching to see what would come next. For James and Sheila Carter, the fight for justice had evolved into a mission to create lasting change, not just in Cedar Brook, but as an example for other communities grappling with similar issues. The first major victory came with the establishment of the Civilian Oversight Board. Mayor Evelyn Sanders, bowing to public pressure, appointed a diverse group of community leaders, activists, and legal experts to the board, ensuring that it would have the power to hold the police department accountable. James and Sheila were invited to be honorary advisors to the board, a role they accepted cautiously. "This is a good start," James said during the board's first meeting. "But oversight means nothing without action. We need to turn policies into practice." The board's first mandate was to review all pending complaints against the department and reopen cases that had been dismissed under questionable circumstances. The task was monumental, uncovering years of systemic failures that had gone unchecked. Patterns of discriminatory arrests, ignored complaints, and doctored evidence began to emerge, implicating not just Reynolds but a network of officers who had operated with impunity. The revelations were damning, and the public's anger reignited. One of the cases that resurfaced involved a young black man named Andrew Green, who had been arrested 3 years earlier on charges of resisting arrest. The evidence against him had been flimsy, and witnesses had testified that Andrew had been assaulted by officers before being taken into custody. The case had been quietly closed, with no consequences for the officers involved. Now, under the civilian board's scrutiny, it became a rallying point for activists demanding justice for past victims of police misconduct. Andrew's case became personal for Sheila, who saw in him a young man whose life had been derailed by a system that had failed him. She visited him and his family, sitting in their modest living room as Andrew recounted the trauma he had endured. "They didn't just take away my freedom," Andrew said, his voice breaking. "They made me feel like my life didn't matter." Sheila promised Andrew that his case wouldn't be forgotten. "We're going to make this right," she said, her voice firm. "Not just for you, but for everyone who's been silenced." The board's investigation into Andrew's case led to the identification of 2 officers who had falsified reports to cover up their use of excessive force. One of them was Sergeant Paul Turner, a senior officer who had been a mentor to Reynolds. Turner's involvement in multiple questionable incidents came to light, and he was suspended pending further investigation. The dominoes were falling, and the web of corruption within the department was becoming increasingly clear. As the board worked to unravel the department's systemic issues, James and Sheila continued to engage with the community. They attended town hall meetings, spoke at schools, and worked closely with grassroots organizations to rebuild trust between the police and the people they served. At one such meeting, an elderly woman named Mrs. Johnson stood up and shared her story of losing her grandson to police violence years ago. "I thought no one cared," she said, her voice trembling. "But seeing what you're doing now gives me hope." Her words stayed with James, reminding him of why they had started this fight in the first place. "This is about more than fixing a broken system," he said later that evening. "It's about giving people their hope back." The momentum from Reynolds' trial and the board's investigations began to inspire similar movements in nearby towns. Activists from across the state reached out to the Carters, asking for advice on how to replicate Sid Arbrooke's reforms. James and Sheila found themselves at the forefront of a larger movement, their names becoming synonymous with the fight for accountability and justice. But their journey wasn't without setbacks. The resistance from within the department was fierce, with some officers openly defying the new oversight measures. Anonymous threats against the Carters became more frequent, and their home was vandalized one night with graffiti that read, "Traitors." The stress began to take a toll, but James and Sheila refused to back down. "If they think they can scare us into silence," Sheila said defiantly, "they haven't been paying attention." The turning point came when the state attorney general announced a full-scale investigation into the Sid Arbrook Police Department, prompted by the civilian board's findings. The investigation revealed a deeply entrenched culture of bias, corruption, and abuse that extended to the highest levels of leadership. Several officers resigned in disgrace, while others faced criminal charges. Chief Barrett, who had initially tried to present himself as a reformer, was forced to step down after it was revealed that he had ignored complaints against Reynolds and other officers for years. With Barrett gone, the department underwent a complete overhaul. A new chief, Angela Morrison, was brought in from outside the town. Morrison, a black woman with a reputation for integrity and community-focused policing, wasted no time in implementing sweeping changes. She dismantled the old power structures within the department, introduced mandatory anti-bias training, and worked closely with the civilian board to ensure transparency. For the first time in years, Sid Arbrook began to feel a sense of hope. Crime rates dropped as community trust in the police increased, and programs aimed at fostering positive relationships between officers and residents flourished. The Carters' vision of a department that served and protected all citizens equally was finally becoming a reality. As the dust began to settle, James and Sheila took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. They stood together in the park where the incident had taken place, now the site of a newly erected mural celebrating the community's resilience. The mural depicted scenes of unity and justice, with the Carters at its center, holding hands with children of all races. "This isn't just about us," Sheila said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's about everyone who believed in something better and refused to give up." James nodded. "We've come a long way, but the work isn't done. It never is." As they walked away from the mural, hand in hand, they were approached by a young boy who shyly handed them a drawing. It was a simple picture of a police badge with the words, "Thank you," written underneath. James knelt down, his eyes misty. "What's your name?" he asked. "Malik," the boy replied. "I want to be a police officer when I grow up. Like you." James smiled, his heart full. "You'll be a great one, Malik. Just remember to always stand for what's right." The Carters' journey had transformed Cedar Brook, but its true impact was far greater. Their courage and determination had sparked a movement that would inspire others for years to come. As they walked away, the crowd gathered around the mural began to chant once again, not just for the Carters, but for justice, for hope, and for a brighter future. Months after the reforms began reshaping Cedar Brook, the town stood as a symbol of resilience and transformation. The Civilian Oversight Board was fully operational. The police department had been restructured under Chief Angela Morrison's leadership, and trust between the community and law enforcement was steadily improving. Yet for James and Sheila Carter, the journey was far from over. The echoes of their fight for justice reverberated beyond Cedar Brook, pulling them into a national conversation about systemic change. The Carter story was being shared at conferences, televised town halls, and university panels across the country. They were invited to speak about their experiences and the hard-won lessons from their battle in Cedar Brook. Sheila often led with her trademark fiery determination, recounting the humiliation they endured and the courage it took to stand up against entrenched power. James balanced her passion with calm, thoughtful analysis, focusing on practical strategies for reform and the importance of accountability. Together, their voices became a powerful catalyst for change. During one such event at a community center in a neighboring city, an elderly man approached James after their speech. His hands trembled as he held out a faded newspaper clipping. "This is my son," the man said, his voice breaking. "He died in police custody 20 years ago. They said it was an accident, but I never believed them. Watching you and your wife fight, it gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth will finally come out." James took the clipping with care, his heart heavy. "We can't undo the past," he said softly, "but we can make sure no one else has to go through what your family did." As stories like this emerged, the Carters realized the depth of the impact they were having. Their work wasn't just about policy changes or improved relationships between police and communities. It was about giving people a sense of justice and dignity that had long been denied. Yet, with every success, there were reminders of how much more work lay ahead. One evening, as they sat on their porch, exhausted from another day of meetings and speeches, Sheila turned to James. "Do you ever feel like it's too much? Like no matter how hard we fight, it'll never be enough?" James looked out at the quiet street, the distant sound of children playing Carrying on the Breeze. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I think about Malik, or that man with the newspaper clipping, or Mrs. Johnson at the town hall. And I realize that even if we can't fix everything, we can still make things better for someone." Sheila smiled, her hand finding his. "I guess that's what keeps me going too." Their resolve was soon put to the test again. A neighboring town, still grappling with its own issues of police misconduct, reached out for help. A young black woman named Tasha had been wrongfully detained by officers who claimed she fit the description of a robbery suspect. 6 months after the reforms began reshaping Cedar Brook, the town stood as a symbol of resilience and transformation. The Civilian Oversight Board was fully operational. The police department had been restructured under Chief Angela Morrison's leadership, and trust between the community and law enforcement was steadily improving. Yet for James and Sheila Carter, the journey was far from over. The echoes of their fight for justice reverberated beyond Cedar Brook, pulling them into a national conversation about systemic change. The Carter story was being shared at conferences, televised town halls, and university panels across the country. They were invited to speak about their experiences and the hard-won lessons from their battle in Cedar Brook. Sheila often led with her trademark fiery determination, recounting the humiliation they endured and the courage it took to stand up against entrenched power. James balanced her passion with calm, thoughtful analysis, focusing on practical strategies for reform and the importance of accountability. Together, their voices became a powerful catalyst for change.